Bear saves California man from mountain lion. What happened next is unbelievable. David Walker had always felt at home in the wilderness. The dense forests of Northern California were his refuge, a place where he could escape the noise of the city and lose himself in the rhythm of nature. The towering redwoods, their ancient trunks stretching toward the sky, filled him with a deep sense of peace. The crisp mountain air, tinged with the scent of pine and damp earth, was a welcome relief from the stale confines of his small San Francisco apartment. Hiking alone was something he had done for years, and though friends often warned him about the dangers, unstable terrain, unpredictable weather, and of course the wildlife, he had always dismissed their concerns with a confident laugh. He knew how to handle himself out here, at least he thought he did. That morning he had set out early, following a winding trail that led deep into the forest. Sunlight streamed through the canopy, dappling the ground in patches of gold. Birds chirped overhead, their songs blending with the distant rush of a river cutting through the valley below. It was the kind of day that reminded him why he loved being here. He hiked for hours, taking in the beauty around him, pausing occasionally to sip water from his canteen or adjust the straps of his backpack. He had planned to reach a secluded ridge by noon, a spot he had discovered years ago that offered an unparalleled view of the sprawling wilderness. But as he moved deeper into the woods, something began to feel off. The usual chorus of the forest had grown eerily silent. The birds had stopped singing. The rustling of small animals in the underbrush had vanished. A prickling sensation ran down his spine, a primal instinct warning him that he was no longer alone. David slowed his steps, his boots crunching softly against the dry leaves. His eyes darted around, scanning the dense foliage for any sign of movement. He had encountered black bears before, even seen the occasional coyote, but they had always kept their distance. He had never felt truly threatened. But this was different. This was the feeling of being hunted. A low growl rumbled through the trees, barely audible, but unmistakable. His breath hitched. His hand instinctively reached for the hunting knife strapped to his belt, though he knew it would be little use against what was stalking him. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head and locked eyes with the predator. The mountain lion was massive, its tawny coat blending seamlessly with the sun-dappled shadows. Its muscles were taut beneath its sleek fur, its golden eyes locked onto him with an intensity that sent a jolt of fear through his veins. He had read about mountain lion encounters before. They were ambush predators, striking from behind, going straight for the neck. If you saw one before it attacked, it was already too late. The big cat took a slow step forward, its tail flicking. David forced himself to hold his ground, remembering the advice he had read in countless survival guides. Don't run. Running would trigger its instinct to chase, and he would never be able to outrun it. He spread his arms wide, trying to make himself look larger. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Get out of here!" The mountain lion didn't flinch. It crouched lower, its muscles coiling, preparing to lunge. David's heart pounded. He knew he had mere seconds before the animal attacked. His mind raced through his limited options. His knife wouldn't be enough to stop a full-grown cougar. His bear spray was buried in his pack, useless to him now. He reached down, grasping for a large stick at his feet, but as soon as he moved, the mountain lion struck. A blur of muscle and claws, it launched itself at him with terrifying speed. David barely had time to raise his arm before the full weight of the predator slammed into him, knocking him backward. Pain exploded in his shoulder as razor-sharp claws raked across his jacket, slicing through fabric and skin. He hit the ground hard. The breath knocked from his lungs. The lion was on top of him, its snarling face inches from his own. He struggled, bringing up his arms to shield his throat, feeling the hot breath of the beast against his skin. Then out of nowhere, a thunderous roar shattered the silence of the forest. The weight of the mountain lion was suddenly gone. Dazed, David scrambled backward, his hand pressing against the deep gashes on his shoulder as he tried to comprehend what was happening. A massive shape had barreled into the clearing, colliding with the mountain lion and sending it rolling across the forest floor. A bear, but not just any bear. This one was enormous, its dark fur rippling with power. The mountain lion hissed, recovering quickly, its ears flattening against its skull as it sized up this new threat. Moment, the two apex predators faced off, their eyes locked in a deadly standoff. The bear let out another earth-shaking roar, rearing onto its hind legs, making itself appear even larger. The mountain lion hesitated. Then, with a final sharp snarl, it turned and bolted into the trees, disappearing into the shadows as swiftly as it had appeared. David remained frozen, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His gaze shifted to the bear, still standing on its hind legs, its deep brown eyes now focused on him. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, but he knew better. He had just seen what this bear was capable of. It had saved his life. But why? And what would it do now? Slowly, cautiously, the bear dropped back onto all fours. It huffed, nostrils flaring, as it took a step toward him. David's grip tightened around the stick he had managed to hold on to, though he knew it was laughably inadequate against a creature of this size. The bear sniffed the air, its massive head tilting slightly as if assessing him. Then, to his astonishment, it simply turned and began to walk away. David sat in stunned silence, watching as the bear disappeared into the forest, its massive frame blending into the trees. His heart still hammered in his chest, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The pain in his shoulder brought him back to reality, and he winced as he examined the bloody gashes left by the mountain lion's claws. He needed to get back to his campsite. He needed to clean the wounds, get some rest, and try to make sense of it all. Staggering to his feet, he cast one last glance in the direction the bear had gone. Something told him this wasn't the last time he would see it. David's body ached with every step as he made his way back to his campsite. His shoulder throbbed where the mountain lion's claws had torn through his jacket, the warmth of his own blood seeping into the fabric. His mind was still reeling from what had happened, from the sheer impossibility of it. A bear had saved his life. That alone defied everything he thought he knew about the wild. He had always respected nature's rules. Predators did not interfere with each other's hunts unless they had a direct reason to. Bears were opportunists, scavengers at times, but they were not known for coming to the aid of a human. And yet that's exactly what had happened. The bear hadn't just chased off the mountain lion. It had looked at him, acknowledged him, and then walked away, as if it had made a choice. The thought sent another shiver down his spine, this one not from fear, but from something deeper. Wonder, maybe even gratitude. He was alive because of that bear. The familiar sight of his campsite brought a flood of relief. His tent was still there, nestled in the clearing where he had set it up that morning, untouched by the chaos that had unfolded just miles away. His supplies were exactly where he had left them. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the forest itself refused to acknowledge what had transpired. He dropped his backpack beside the tent and immediately dug through it, searching for his first aid kit. His hands were shaking as he unscrewed the cap from his water bottle, pouring it over the wounds on his shoulder to wash away the blood. The sting was immediate, sharp and biting, but he gritted his teeth and pressed a clean gauze pad against the cuts. They weren't as deep as he had feared, but they would still need proper treatment when he got back to town. For now, this would have to do. He wrapped a bandage around his shoulder as best he could, his movements stiff and clumsy from exhaustion. Once his wounds were tended to, he collapsed onto the ground beside the campfire ring, rubbing his face with both hands. He needed to think. What had just happened out there? More importantly, why had it happened? The mountain lion had been hunting him. There was no question about that. If the bear hadn't intervened, he wouldn't be sitting here right now, breathing in the crisp evening air, feeling the ache in his muscles as proof that he was still alive. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath cloud in the cooling air. The logical part of his brain told him to pack up and leave first thing in the morning. He had already pushed his luck once today, but another part of him, the part that couldn't stop replaying the moment when the bear had turned and walked away, wanted answers. He couldn't just forget what had happened. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flash of the mountain lion's teeth, felt the weight of its body knocking him down. But more than that, he saw the bear. The way it had charged out of nowhere, its sheer power overwhelming the cougar in an instant. the way it had stood there afterward, studying him. What had it been thinking? Could it even think the way he was attributing to it? Or was he just assigning human logic to something beyond his understanding? It circled his mind until exhaustion finally pulled him under. And when he awoke the next morning, the first thing he did was check the forest around him. It was quiet again, peaceful, no signs of the mountain lion, no signs of the bear. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined the entire thing, but the bandages on his shoulder told him otherwise. Instead of hiking back to his car, as he had originally planned, he found himself following the same trail that had nearly led to his demise. His body protested the movement, but his curiosity drove him forward. He retraced his steps carefully, moving slower than before, his senses heightened. He reached the spot where the attack had happened, where the ground was still disturbed from the struggle. Claw marks were raked through the dirt, tufts of fur clung to the underbrush, evidence of the battle between predator and protector. He crouched down, running his fingers over the marks left behind. There was no mistaking it. This was real. It had happened. His gaze lifted to the trees, searching for any sign of the bear. He knew it was foolish to expect to see it again so soon, but something in his gut told him it was still nearby. Maybe watching him. He wasn't sure how he knew, but the feeling settled deep into his bones. He stood, adjusting his pack, and made a decision. He would leave something behind. A gesture, however small, to acknowledge what had happened. He pulled out a protein bar from his bag, unwrapping it and placing it on the rock where he had fallen the day before. It wasn't much, but it was something, a silent offering. Then he turned and walked away. Over the next few days, he found himself coming back. Each time he left something behind, food, a piece of fruit, even a small can of salmon he had brought for his trip. He wasn't sure why he did it, only that it felt right. He never saw the bear take the food, but each time he returned, the offering was gone. The thought filled him with a strange sort of satisfaction. On the fourth day, he arrived at the clearing and froze. This time something was waiting for him. A single fish, freshly caught, lay atop the same rock where he had been leaving food. He stared at it, his heart hammering in his chest. Was this a coincidence? Had another animal left it behind? Or was it meant for him? He swallowed hard, glancing around the trees, suddenly aware of how alone he was. Or maybe not alone at all. His pulse quickened as he realized what this could mean. The bear knew. It understood. A deep exhale left his lips, part wonder, part disbelief. He crouched down, staring at the fish as if it held some hidden answer he couldn't quite grasp. Then slowly, carefully, he picked it up. He didn't take it with him. Instead, he walked to the edge of the clearing, where a small stream trickled through the forest, and set it back into the water. A return of the gesture. Then he stood back, waiting, listening. The forest remained silent, but something inside him told him this was just the beginning. The days that followed were filled with an anticipation David had never known before. Each morning, he would wake with the same thought. Would the bear come back? And each evening, as he hiked the familiar trails, he felt the weight of unseen eyes on him, an unspoken presence lingering just beyond his vision. He no longer feared it, not the way he had feared the mountain lion. That terror had been raw and immediate, the kind that set his instincts ablaze. But this was different. This was curiosity, a fascination so deep it had burrowed into his bones. He had never felt such a connection with anything before. Not with another person, certainly not with an animal. Yet here he was, exchanging silent offerings with a creature that should have had no reason to acknowledge him at all. He continued leaving food, and each time it was taken, but the bear never revealed itself. The fish had been the first and only thing left in return, a moment so surreal that he found himself questioning it in the dead of night, wondering if it had all been coincidence. Yet something in his gut told him it wasn't. The bear knew, and for some reason, it had chosen to engage with him, however subtly. It wasn't until nearly a week after their first encounter that David finally saw it again. He had returned to the clearing as he always did, a small offering of fresh berries in hand, when he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. He froze, his heart hammering as he slowly turned his head. And there it was, half shrouded in the underbrush. watching him. The bear. Its presence was overwhelming. Even standing motionless, its sheer size radiated power. Thick, dark fur framed a massive head, and those deep-set brown eyes locked onto him with an intelligence that made his breath catch. The bear wasn't moving, wasn't threatening. It was just watching, hard, every nerve in his body screaming at him to be cautious, to back away slowly, to respect the laws of nature that warned against standing too close to something so powerful. And yet, he didn't move. He knelt instead, slow and deliberate, placing the berries on the same rock as always. His fingers brushed against the cool stone, and for a moment, he thought he saw the bear's ears flick in acknowledgement. Then, just as silently as it had appeared, the creature turned and lumbered back into the woods, disappearing as if it had never been there. David exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his entire body trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. The bear had come, it had let him see it, had acknowledged him in a way that went beyond mere curiosity. He wasn't just some passing figure in its territory anymore. He was something else, and the thought both thrilled and unnerved him. That night, he sat by his campfire, staring into the flames, replaying every moment in his mind. He had spent his whole life studying nature, observing wildlife from a respectful distance, believing himself to be an outsider in a world that didn't belong to him. But now, for the first time, he wondered if that was true. Could it be that this bear, this wild, untamed force of nature, had accepted him? Was such a thing even possible? The next day, he ventured deeper into the woods, not just to leave another offering, but to search. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Tracks, a den, anything that might give him some insight into where the bear lived, how it moved through this vast, unspoiled land. He followed the natural pathways, noting broken branches and flattened patches of earth where something large had passed through. His training told him to be careful, to respect the bear's space, but his curiosity propelled him forward. Hours passed before he finally found it. A clearing, larger than the one where they had first met, nestled between a cluster of towering trees. The ground was marked with deep scratches, remnants of powerful claws raking against the dirt, and near the base of one tree, a massive indentation in the earth, where something large had been resting. The bear's den. David crouched at the edge of the clearing, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. He had found its home, or at least one of its resting places. He knew he should turn back, that pressing any further could be seen as intrusion, but something made him pause. There, near the entrance to the den, was another offering, a small weathered bone, placed carefully atop a smooth, flat stone. He stared at it, his chest tightening with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. This wasn't a random discard. It had been placed there, like the fish, like the way he had been leaving food, a gift. A shiver ran down his spine, not of fear, but of understanding. This wasn't just some accidental exchange. This was intentional. He looked around, scanning the shadows, half expecting to see the bear watching him again. But the woods were still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Slowly, reverently, he reached forward, brushing his fingers against the bone's smooth surface before carefully placing it back. He didn't take it, not yet. Instead, he stood, backing away the way he had come, giving the clearing the respect it deserved. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay awake in his tent, listening to the forest, every crack of a branch or distant hoot of an owl making him wonder if the bear was nearby. He thought of the stories he had read, the legends of ancient cultures that spoke of men and bears sharing an understanding, of spirits that watched over the land in the form of these mighty creatures. He had always dismissed them as myth, poetic interpretations of the natural world. But now he wasn't so sure. The next morning, he returned to the clearing. This time, he didn't just leave food. He brought something else. A small carving, one he had whittled the night before by firelight. It was crude, little more than a rough silhouette of a bear, but it was the best he could do with the tools he had. He placed it on the stone beside the bone, stepping back with a deep breath. If the bear truly understood, if this was more than just coincidence, it would know. Then, with the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them, he turned and walked away, leaving behind the first piece of a story still being written. The forest was different now. David could feel it with every step he took. It wasn't just a place he walked through anymore. It was a place he was part of. The wind in the trees, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant call of a bird, everything felt more alive, more connected. He had spent years hiking these trails, believing he understood the wilderness, but now he realized he had only been a visitor, an observer looking in from the outside. The bear had saved him. Everything had changed. There was something unspoken between them now, a thread that tied them together in ways he couldn't explain. And every day that passed, he found himself searching for proof that he wasn't imagining it. The morning after he left the carving, he returned to the clearing, unsure of what he would find. His heart pounded as he approached, his pulse quickening with anticipation. The stone where he had placed the small wooden bear was bare. The carving was gone. But something else had been left behind. A single thick feather, deep brown with golden edges, lay in its place. David stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. It was a gift, another exchange. He crouched down, running his fingers over the delicate strands of the feather, feeling the smoothness of it, the weight of what it meant. He looked around the clearing, scanning the shadows, half expecting to see the bear watching him again. But there was nothing, just the forest, quiet and knowing. He swallowed hard and carefully picked up the feather, holding it as if it were something sacred. He carried it back to his camp, setting it beside the fire as he sat down, staring at it as though it might hold the answers he was looking for. The realization was sinking in, deeper than before. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't an animal simply taking what was offered. This was something else, a connection, a conversation without words. He had left something behind, and the bear had responded. What did it mean? Did the bear understand, in some way, that David wasn't a threat? That he wasn't just another human passing through its world? He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. There were no easy answers, no way to explain what was happening in a way that made sense. He only knew that it felt right, that it felt real. That night, as he lay in his tent, staring up at the fabric illuminated by the faint glow of the moon, he wondered how far this would go, how long this exchange would continue. He thought about the mountain lion, about how close he had come to death, and how the bear had changed everything. Was this fate? Luck? Or was there something more at work here? He turned onto his side, listening to the sounds of the forest, wondering if somewhere out there, the bear was listening too. The next day, he made a decision. If the bear could leave something for him, then maybe he could do the same. He spent the afternoon searching, his mind turning over the idea of what might be an appropriate gift. Food was one thing, but this was different. This was personal. He wanted to offer something meaningful, something that wasn't just an object but a gesture, an acknowledgement of what was happening between them. Eventually, he settled on something simple but deliberate, a river stone, smooth and perfectly round, something he had carried with him for years. It had always been a reminder of home, of the first trip he had taken into the wilderness as a child. He had never parted with it, but now for the first time, he felt that it belonged here more than with him. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor, he returned to the clearing. The air was cool, the scent of pine thick around him. He approached the stone where the exchanges had taken place and placed the river stone carefully at its center. Then he stepped back, waiting, hoping. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, listening to the rustling of the leaves, the whisper of the wind through the trees. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, if the bear would appear, if there would be some sign that it understood. But nothing happened. After a while, he exhaled and turned to leave, trusting that if this was meant to continue, it would. The night was restless. He kept waking, listening, feeling the pull of something unseen. Each time he drifted back into sleep, his dreams were filled with shadows moving through the trees, deep brown eyes watching him from the darkness. A presence that was neither threatening nor familiar, but something in between. When dawn finally broke, he wasted no time in heading back to the clearing. His steps were quicker now, anticipation tightening in his chest. When he reached the stone, he stopped cold. The river stone was gone. In its place was something he never could have expected, a claw, dark, thick, and curved, like something shed from a powerful creature. David stared at it, his pulse hammering. His mind raced with questions. Had the bear left this? Had it been a message? A mark of trust? He reached down, hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the smooth, hardened surface of the claw. It was old, worn from time and weather. It had belonged to something large. He swallowed hard, lifting it carefully, feeling the weight of it in his palm. His breath came slower now, steadier. Life believing he understood the wild, believing that it operated on instinct, on simple rules of survival. But this defied explanation. This was not just survival. This was understanding, a language spoken without words. The claw was a symbol of what? He wasn't sure yet, but he would find out. He looked around once more, searching the forest for any sign of the bear, for anything that would tell him it was near. But the trees remained still, their secrets held close. David exhaled and closed his fingers around the claw. He didn't know where this path was leading him, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking it alone. The weight of the claw in David's hand felt heavier than it should have, not in mass but in meaning. He turned it over slowly, studying the smooth edges, the sharp curve, the way time had worn it down but not broken it. He exhaled, a slow breath that misted in the cool air, his heartbeat steady but his mind restless with questions. Why this? Why now? The bear had taken his offerings before, food, a carving, a stone. But this was different. This wasn't just an exchange. This was a piece of the bear itself, something shed, something given. He clenched his fingers around it, feeling the roughness press into his palm, a grounding sensation that reminded him this was real, that all of it had been real. He had never sought this connection. It had found him, forged in the chaos of a predator's ambush, and solidified in the quiet moments afterward. He had come to this place expecting solitude, but instead, he had found something impossible, a bond. The forest around him felt alive in a way it never had before. The trees whispering with the wind, the earth beneath his boots holding a presence he had only recently begun to recognize. He knew what he had to do. One last offering, not to continue the exchange, but to end it with meaning. He had taken from the land all his life, walked its paths, breathed its air, let it heal him when the weight of the world grew too much. But now he wanted to give something back, something that would remain long after he was gone. That evening, as the sky bled into hues of orange and violet, he sat by his fire working with steady hands. The claw rested beside him, a reminder, a presence. He took his knife and a fresh piece of wood from the bundle he had gathered earlier, and he began to carve. His fingers worked slowly, methodically, shaping the wood with patience, his mind sinking into the rhythm of creation. It was a bear, of course, not a perfect one, but a figure with broad shoulders, a lowered head, powerful and steady. He carved with intention, not just in shape, but in meaning. The lines he etched into its form mirrored the trees that surrounded him, the rivers that cut through the land, the spirit of the wild that had taken him in and changed him. By the time he finished, the moon had risen high, casting silver light over the clearing. He ran his fingers over the carving, feeling the rough edges, the small imperfections that made it real. He set it beside the claw, the two objects side by side, and then he closed his eyes. He didn't speak. There was no need for words. The offering was made. The next morning, he made his way back to the clearing where the exchanges had taken place. His steps were slower now, reverent, as though he was crossing into sacred ground. When he reached the stone, he knelt, setting the carving down carefully. Beside it, he placed the claw. He hadn't expected to return it at first, but now it felt right. He had been given something precious, a mark of trust, and in return, he wanted to leave something of equal worth. He pressed his fingers against the carving one last time, then stood, taking a step back. He would not return tomorrow. He would not come back to check if the offering had been taken. This was not about waiting for a response. It was about closure. As he turned to leave, a shift in the air made him stop, a presence. He knew it before he saw it, felt it deep in his bones, an energy that was neither fear nor threat, but something greater. He turned slowly, and there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the bear. It was closer than it had ever been before, massive in the soft light of dawn, its dark fur blending with the shadows of the trees. Its eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, locked onto his. He did not move. Neither did the bear. They stood in silence, the forest around them holding its breath. And then, after what felt like eternity, the bear took a step forward. Not aggressive, not hesitant, just deliberate. It approached the stone, its heavy paws pressing into the earth, its breath visible in the cool morning air. It lowered its head, sniffing the carving, then exhaled in a slow, rumbling huff. David didn't dare move, his pulse steady but his heart hammering in his chest. The bear lifted its head again, looking at him once more. As if making a final decision, it did something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It sat, not fully, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, a silent understanding passing between them, deeper than language, older than time, a farewell. And then, just as slowly as it had arrived, the bear rose, turning back toward the forest. It didn't run. It didn't disappear in an instant. It walked, steady and unhurried, fading into the trees until only the rustling of branches remained. David stood there long after it was gone, staring at the place where it had been, at the carving still resting on the stone. The weight of the moment pressed into his chest, not heavy, but full of something he could never explain. He let out a slow breath and turned toward the path that led home. As he walked, he realized he wasn't leaving empty-handed. The forest had given him something far greater than a claw, or a feather, or a fish. It had given him a story, a connection, a truth he would carry with him forever. And as he stepped into the light of morning, he knew that somewhere, deep in the wild, the bear carried it too.